Is this reality actually a simulation, a video game, or more specifically, a roguelike? Are we but players isekai'd into this world, with God as the divine game designer? Like a lot of priests, I sometimes get the urge to binge on the theoretical physics side of YouTube, with recent forays taking me to videos exploring the nature of light and the question of whether we are in the Matrix, living in a simulated universe which only appears real when it is observed. These theories might once have been on the fringe, but today they would appear to be surprisingly mainstream. And a common theme one encounters is for scientists or commentators to draw comparisons to modern video games, in which the world doesn't fully exist until it enters the player's view. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. This current footage, by the way, is taken from Scanner Somber, a game which takes place almost entirely in pitch-black darkness, in which the player uses an emitter to paint the subterranean world with particles, giving shape to that darkness so that you can navigate it. Could it be that our universe only has a definite shape after it is painted by sensory perception? As skeptics love to remind believers, such claims require evidence. Now, as I've stated before, evidence is anything that supports a thesis. That means not just empirical, but also experiential, historical, and philosophical evidence. And proponents of simulation theory do point to these broader categories. For instance, lived experiences like déjà vu, when you have a new experience that you could swear you've had before, or the Mandela effect, in which you have what feels like a concrete memory of an event, such as remembering Nelson Mandela having died in prison, only to later learn that the reality does not match your memory. Experiences like these are said to evidence what might be called glitches in the universe, fragments lingering in your mind in the wake of the reality simulation correcting itself. Likewise, you'll find arguments like this one from Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Someone programs a universe, and in there they gain maturity and technology, and then they program a universe, and then they program a universe. So you can have nested, simulated universes all the way down, but there's only one real universe. Now throw a dart at all those universes. Which one are you most likely to hit? A simulated universe.
This type of, if A is possible, then B is probable, argumentation essentially amounts to philosophical evidence, relying not on measured phenomenon, but on logical reasoning. These arguments are thought-provoking, but personally, I don't think simulation theory would have as much acceptance as we see today if it didn't have some empirical evidence to support it. While there are parallels to some religious claims, this theory concerns the physical properties of the universe, so a bit of physical evidence is in order. And as it happens, such clues do exist. Now, I do wish to emphasize here that evidence and proof are two different things. For the religious believer, we look to evidence which points us toward God, yet recognize that that evidence falls short of verifiable proof. After all, if we had proof, faith would be unnecessary. God desires followers who have a backbone, who are courageous enough to risk a little uncertainty. The empirical evidence for simulation theory is similar. It's not entirely provable. Alternative theories can still be put forth, but that doesn't mean that it isn't compelling. One of the leading experiments that proponents look to for that evidence is the famous double-slit experiment. There are already a ton of videos out there describing this in great detail, so I'm just going to give a very brief and basic explanation. The experiment involves firing photons or electrons toward a barrier with two adjacent slits, then measuring the pattern that emerges when what passes through strikes the wall beyond. When that measurement is taken after the fact, without any observer actively recording it, what emerges is an interference pattern, as one would expect from waves like water surging through a pair of gaps. However, when an observer is taking in the action, that pattern changes, mirroring the two slits, as one would expect from individual particles being fired like bullets. This mysterious phenomenon is called wave function collapse. It's why light is said to behave both like a wave and like a particle, having wave-particle duality, an attribute which looms large in the vast but tiny quantum world. There are various interpretations out there which attempt to tackle this mystery, but at present it remains just that. And a core principle of quantum mechanics is that the unobserved particles are not just maybe in position A or B or C, but truly existing simultaneously in any number of positions or states, or possibly in none of them. Us humans are still a long way from cracking the quantum code, but one way of making sense of this duality is to essentially propose dual universes. Imagine that there exists both a universe of possibilities and a universe of actualities, with the former transforming into the latter only upon being observed. One can see here the connection to video games, to how an in-game world exists as a set of instructions, lines of code which only fully activate, only fully rendering that world space when the player brings it into view. With most new games, this happens almost instantly, but there are some titles, and plenty of older games, in which you can see that rendering happening in real time, as textures load in and geometry gains detail. There are some theoretical models, like the timeless light model which I recently stumbled across, which put forth that the speed of light itself is nothing less than the rendering speed of the universe. Now keep in mind that universe of possibilities, which I mentioned, is not something which exists solely in your head when weighing one choice versus another. Rather, it is physically coded into the fabric of reality. That's where my roguelike analogy comes in, as those possibilities, they resemble the range of RNG elements in many a roguelike game. For this gameplay, I'll be using Ember Knights, a great little title which takes some cues from Hades. I definitely recommend the base game, though in its present state, the DLC is only for those who are gluttons for punishment. Like many games in the genre, you travel from room to room, fighting and looting as you go, but for most of those spaces, you don't exactly know what the next room will look like or what enemies it holds until you get there. The possibilities are not endless. There's a range of potential rooms and drops and encounters, and likewise, in our universe, there are things which we can have a high level of confidence about when it comes to what the future holds. Thus, quantum mechanics does not render general relativity useless or obsolete. But on the quantum level, that same "you won't know until you get there" principle still applies. It may be that our universe operates quite a bit like a roguelike. But I can already hear some of my Christian listeners saying, "Father Don, why even give an idea like this the time of day? This world is real, so is heaven, and so is hell." While it may be dressed up as science, simulation theory is nothing more than repackaged New Age nonsense. And in many cases, that reaction is right on the money. There are a lot of out there spins on this theory, and even that word, simulation, is potentially deceptive. Our use of rendering to create artificial worlds does not mean that any world which is rendered must be artificial. Such reasoning could further imply that my actions in this life carry no greater moral weight than how I decide to behave in Grand Theft Auto. And if people bought into that, our world and our souls would definitely be in trouble. Obviously, I do agree that our world is real. But must that term real describe a binary state, as if something must either be real or unreal? Could reality instead exist on a spectrum, with various things being more or less real? And what if I told you that such a vision is actually right in keeping with classic Christian theology? Saint Thomas Aquinas speaks of the ladder of being, also called the great chain of being, in which not just goodness but existence itself finds its source in God. To have being, to be, is something which belongs perfectly to God's nature, and from God flows forth, such that created things possess more or less existence, are more or less real, in proportion to how closely they resemble God. This makes a lot of sense when you consider, for instance, how God describes himself. He says to Moses, "I am who I am," sometimes translated as "I am who am," or "I am who is." Jesus says of himself, "Before Abraham was, I am. The Lord is, He who is. To put it simply, nothing is more real than God, and the more like God someone or something is, the more real it is. This vision can also be applied to creation's various realms. Aquinas, like Augustine before him, saw traces of this in the best of the pagan philosophers, with figures such as Plato proposing a perfect, unchanging world of forms as a higher plane, our physical universe consisting of components that are but imperfect copies. For me, it brings to mind the classic C.S. Lewis novel, The Great Divorce, in which the protagonist is transported to a realm resembling either hell or purgatory, a bleak cityscape that appears to stretch far and wide, until one hops on a flying bus for a lift out. Beyond the clouds and the soaring cliffs, that land begins to dwindle, at last revealing itself to be no more than a crevice one might easily step over, like a crack in the sidewalk. Sweeping fields stretch forth and slope up toward a shining mountaintop city. This new place is vastly more real, but to even set foot there, you yourself must have sufficient existence, enough so that the blades of grass bend beneath your feet rather than pierce through your ephemeral form. To see God and live, you must be real enough to be seen. This life is real, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a more real life awaiting us. May you find your way there. May you like and subscribe, and may we pray for one another until we meet again.